Hello everybody. Welcome to this edition of Aztec on Air. Uh, we are very fortunate today to have Justin Dillon with us. He is actually professor of science education and environmental education at the University of Exeter in England, which is, I understand, in the southeast of the country, but also is president of the National Association of Environmental Education. Uh, Justin, thanks for being with us. The occasion was that recently you became the editor-in-chief of the magazine about science education, and somehow you have a career that has been moving between formal and informal education in many ways, and many of the people who will watch today or later the recording in our field know you mostly from your informal education period. But so thanks for being with us again, and but tell me a little bit more about us, about you, because originally you were a teacher, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Walter. It's really, really good to be invited. Really nice to be invited to this conversation. It's a great pleasure to have a transatlantic chat with you. Yeah. So I was my background was I trained as I did my first degree was in chemistry, and my bachelor's degree, and then I didn't really fancy going into the chemical industry, so people said, "Oh, you should be a teacher." So I ended up training to be a teacher in London. Taught in high schools in London for 10 years, and enjoyed it. Had a good time. I also got involved in training teachers and doing a bit of education research. And a job came up at King's College London, and I jumped at the chance. It was a job I'd always sort of wanted to do, and so yeah. But I'd had, well, as a teacher, I'd been involved in researching learning. I was always interested in learning, and it was very interested in learning outside the classroom. And in some ways, that formal informal boundary doesn't really exist in the real world. It's a simple way we think about schools and non-schools, but actually the learning that takes place, in museums and science centres is the same learning. It's just a different context, really. Yeah, and so I had 26 years at King's, which is where I got to know you through our the NSF funded Centre for Informal Learning in Schools. That was started in 2002, I think. I went on for a number of years, and that sort of got me more into sustained research, looking at the link between schools and museums and science centres.
So it looked to you like a natural transition somehow.
Yeah. It was fantastic. I mean, I think the level of funding was something that we could never really get in the UK. I mean, because you've got a science ministry, a science department funding education research. They were interested. I mean, they were interested in funding research to see how science education could be improved. I think in the early in the early 2000s, people thought science education in schools wasn't really working very well. It wasn't sort of producing enough scientists and engineers, and many people in science education thought it wasn't providing us a rounded education background. And so when the NSF came along and said, look, we're interested in funding research to see if museums and science centres can offer something to schools, people thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And then we could do that. And museums and science centres were interested in ways to work more effectively with schools and get involved in professional development more. So it was a natural partnership. And so we were involved at King's because of our expertise in science education in schools. UC Santa Cruz were involved because of their interest in science engagement. Exploratorium was involved because
it's interesting that you started by saying that there was actually no barrier between the two fields of informal and formal, because many people don't think like that. So why would you think that is, that people still think that these are two different fields?
Well, I think that years ago there would be people who would research in museums and science centres, and there would be people who would research in schools, and there were quite a huge number of people who were researching in schools, but they never really seemed to value research that was going on in museums and the questions that the people asked researching in museums and science centres were different than the questions people asked in schools. And so they didn't speak the same language. But actually, as soon as people started talking to each other, they realized they had so much in common.
But still, yeah, in common, but also still many differences. In a museum, you never have to do a test.
Yeah, that's true, but you're still interested in impact, aren't you? I mean, you're still interested in if if people are paying to go to this exhibition, what are they getting from it? And if people are going to school, you need to be able to say if you're teaching this way, are people learning as a result? So there are, as soon as you dig deeper, you're beginning to discover commonalities really. That's been the big question for the big difference for museums and science centres is you see people for such a short amount of time. Is it possible for that to have any impact on learning? If you can't answer that as a simple yes or no question. You've got to realise that so you might learn in school that whales are huge and very impressive, but unless you've actually been to a natural history museum and seen one, you don't really get how big they are. And so they don't offer competing education. They offer complementary education.
But if I be the devil's advocate somehow, in museums you don't really know what the initial knowledge of the people is that come to visit you. That's also a handicap to try to offer something that's relates to them really well.
Yeah, so I think you have to see that as an advantage. You have to sort of say, well, look, all we can do is we know that people coming to us will have incredibly different experiences and different conceptions. What we have to do is to offer them something which will grab their attention and interest them and give them something memorable they can take away. And if it just creates an extra layer on top of their existing knowledge, if it strengthens their existing knowledge or slightly challenges their existing knowledge, so in order to do that, you need to have a variety of experiences and to be sensitive and then to the people coming to it.
So then, to come back to the beginning of the King's College experience there and the program with National Science Foundation in Santa Cruz and Exploratorium, I guess was involved in that as well very strongly, right? What were the initial questions that you were looking at in that program?
I think there was a sort of meta question, which was what role can learning research play in informing what goes on in museums and science centres, because there hadn't been up to then, I don't think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was there hadn't been a focus so much on processes of learning or evaluating learning in museums and science centres. There'd been a focus on evaluating what worked, and there'd been a focus on what's the best design for something, but there wasn't really an understanding of learning theory. So there was a push to try and engage what we knew about education and learning in schools and see how that could inform museums and science centres. But people were involved in professional development. There's a big push for inquiry-based science education. How can museums and science centres help schools to deliver better quality inquiry? And I think that came out of a sort of a frustration with what was going on in schools, that the quality of science education investigations wasn't good enough, and that museums and science centres, which had this big strong science input, were able to deliver better quality science engagement, better quality investigating inquiry-based science education. And so that was a sort of the focus, I think, but it grew way beyond that, I think, as people.
So, do you have two or three really concrete examples of things that you were involved in, research projects that you were involved in, that were looking at these things?
There was a project called Pencil, which is a European Union project.
Yes, thank you.
And that emerged. That wouldn't have happened without the Civils work. Because Civils, the Centre for Informal Learning in Schools was involved a lot of PhD students coming to the UK to study with us and doing interesting work. And from that emerged work with links with European Union partners. And what the Pencil project did was to say to a range of science centres, look, okay, so we will give you some money to develop what for you is the next step in terms of engaging with schools. And of course, they all did different things. They all had their own priorities. The teachers had different needs. And what was good about that was rather than have a project, which many projects are all about getting everyone to do the same thing, Pencil allowed individual organisations and science centres to say, what we can do is we will do this, and we will do this, and we will do that. And that I think had the changes organisations made weren't huge. They were incremental changes. But they allowed people to say, look, how can research inform what we're doing? And from that grew a capacity, from that grew a confidence that working across Europe and across organisations and linking science centres and universities actually had some value. I don't think before Stills and Pencil came along, that confidence and that capacity was there.
I have to thank you. That was not planned, but you know that Pencil was a program that I launched. That I was at Excite, right? Or do you?
I think Excite.
But thank you for the nice words that you said about it.
I think it was a groundbreaking project in many ways. I mean, all these projects, if you look at in very narrow terms, their success was quite small. You've got to look at how these things grow. You've got to look at how these projects grow. And the links, if you go to the Excite conference or ASTC conferences, the networking, the links between institutions and organisation and people now is way stronger than it was 20 years ago. That's happened because people have had experience of working together.
But at the same time, and thank you again for saying that, the way that science centers were looking at it, thanks to the Pencil project, was different and made this awareness grow. At the same time, the outcomes and how they could translate to implementations of new practices with school was not so successful, I think. I was not there anymore. So what are the barriers actually in the school system to accept change that comes from the informal science education field?
It's tempting to pathologize things and say that things are there's a real problems in implementing change. I think if you look across the whole any education system, whatever country, you will see people who are dedicated to quite radical changes in the system, and you see people who are dedicated to making no change whatsoever. So the skill in engaging with education system is to find those people who are willing to engage in change. So the systemic barriers are an obsession with international comparisons, with high stakes testing. So if we could do one thing, maybe if we could stop all this international testing, we could stop pretending that you can copy from what Finland or Shanghai does and just copy them. If we could just get away from that.
Which is two total different things, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Finland and Shanghai are not the US and the UK. I mean, and actually the quality of science education in Finland or Shanghai isn't that much different than anywhere else in the world. So you have the sort of barriers that people think, well, we can't compete. We can't compete with what museums and science centres have. They're just extra places that you go. And actually, if you look at the pedagogy of museums and science centres, many of the professionals who work in those institutions can take any object and tell a story and make it relevant to your life. And that sort of pedagogical approach is something which many school science teachers aren't trained to do. And you have to be impressed by people who work in science centres who can take a phenomenon, take a group of people they've never met, and give them a memorable experience in 2 or 3 minutes. And that sort of ability to grab people's attention is something which would be nice if we could translate into what goes on in school. Conversely.
And this is very, very coherent, what you say, with the findings of the National Research Foundation here in the US, and that report that was made in 2009 by the Science Board. And if I go over the elements that they gave, it said that informal science education creates experience, excitement, generates, and beats people, it generates that they understand concepts, that they make sense of the natural world, that they can reflect on science, that they participate in scientific activities, and that they think about themselves as science learners. And maybe that's an interesting thing about making people think that they can learn it, right? That may be the biggest difference from my point of view with the schools, where in most of the time it looks like, this is too difficult for me. The Science Center of Informal Field seems to make it more accessible and make it more, allow you more to be part of it and feel yourself part of it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think I'd go even further than what the report was saying. I mean, if you take a class of 30 children who go to a science centre, they're going to get 30 different things from it. They're going to get experiences. Some of them will have hobbies, and those hobbies, they'll see their hobbies manifested in what's going on. Some will have no interest in science, and suddenly something will capture their interest. Some of them will just enjoy being free to wander around. I mean, I think if you try and mandate particular impacts of science centres or museums, it's not going to work. You deny people the opportunity to maximise their engagement, to maximise. So if you go to an art gallery, the art gallery doesn't say, look, we want everyone to learn that, about Matisse and about this. They say, we just want you to experience it as part of culture. So you go to a museum or a science museum or a science centre, the whole point is that this science is part of everyday culture, and you should enable people to go and appreciate the fact that science is all around us, and you can engage it in lots of different ways. And there's all sorts of interesting things happening that you can follow up later on. And that's one of the problems with evaluation with funders.
And I was going to ask that because, we say that and we believe it and that report says it, but, how do you actually measure that, right? So you have been involved in other things. So what is the most successful way of measuring experience that people have in a museum and that it matters?
I think not going in with preconceived ideas about what it is you're going to measure. I remember we had colleagues had an exhibition at Tate Modern, which was looking at materials science, and they set up activity and a talk, and people came along to it, and we, with colleagues at King's, we would talk to people about when you go into this, what are you expecting? They'd tell us what they're expecting. At the end, we would go back to the same people and say, what did you get from it? What did you take away? What surprised you? And they all said different things. They all, so if you're trying to measure one particular outcome, you'd have missed all the other outcomes people were getting. So you have to go and say, well, look, here's an exhibition, here's an experience, here's some phenomenon. What does it mean to you? And people will then bring their memories and bring their ideas. And so you have to sort of look for the broad outcomes, the broad impacts, rather than have a very deep focus on quite narrow ones, because you're going to miss everything.
So is that not a handicap when you want to advocate for the field and for supporting the field in many ways, that there is this kind of evaluation that is more an addition of experiences rather than a matrix with really strong figures?
I mean, you could hypothesize. I mean, you could form an argument that the fact that science museums and science are full of scientists, and the funders tend to be scientists, often neuroscientists, who've got quite a narrow view about measurement and psychology. That part of the science education, science museum problem is that science view of impact and outcomes. If you compare the science education, science museum sector with art and drama and dance, they don't think, oh well, we're just going to have a very narrow impact. They don't ask the same questions about the impact of art galleries and dance and drama events. I think we should take the same approach. We're providing high quality exhibitions, high quality experiences, high quality engagement. You make of it what you want.
I agree with you. And this story, over the last years that I share with many people is that if a city wants to build a science center, people have always to argue about what the impact is going to be, how many kids are going to learn science, are going to go to university, how many engineers are going to form. And it's a very difficult thing to say. On the other hand, if you say, I want to build an opera here, say, oh yeah, we should have an opera as a city. No one is going to measure how many more kids are singing in 10 years from now. So there is like a difference in that regard. It's a little bit frustrating.
It is, yeah, and I think that's a great challenge, a systemic problem. Is funders, is the approach that funders take. Funders take a far too quasi-scientific approach to learning processes, which are not in any way narrowly measurable.
And did you see then an evolution over the years that you were at King's College and maybe now from outside about what were the topics and the concerns for the field and the
Yeah,
research?
so I think now there is far stronger partnerships between universities and people researching learning and museums and science centres. And I think you see that in the US and the UK, you see it in Naturalis in Leiden in the Netherlands, you see it in NEMO in Amsterdam, you see it in different European countries and beyond. A far greater commitment to basing the design of exhibitions and design of programs on what we know about how people learn. One thing, greater focus on families, so people realise that actually, if you can engage families in learning and you maybe have a longer term impact on what people take away from the museums and science centres. And focus on professionalising the people who work in them, so that if you look at high quality science teaching in schools, the skill is in asking questions, not telling people the answers. If you could take some of that, there's I think a shift was taking some of that pedagogy and seeing how you can apply that to what goes on in learning in the museums and science centres. So there's all sorts of shifts and a greater valuing, I think, of learning and education in museums and science centres than there perhaps was 10 years ago. I mean, there are some museums and science centres who don't value learning, who don't value engagement, but I think they're becoming in the minority. And I think the trend is to focus on, look, get the learning and engagement right, you can have a successful institution.
Well, and to be a successful institution, many of us think that we need better ties with the community where we are established in with science centers, and that we need to do more efforts to get underserved communities involved and diverse communities involved. And that, what is your take on that? Is there a specific strategy to apply to make that happen? Because first, is it important to do that? And the second way, if you think it's important, is there like specific things that the research tells us what we should do?
So earlier on, you asked me to give me 2 or 3 examples of research I was involved with that I think has characterized or illustrated groundbreaking work. And I was lucky enough to supervise Emily Dawson, who was doing her, with Johnson Osborne, doing her work, her research into minority ethnic groups in London, 4 different groups who were not engaging with museums and science. And she, after a lot of hard and elegant work, was able to take those groups into museums and say, look, how do you feel? How does it make you feel? Do you feel welcome? Does this make you? Does this resonate with you? And all those 4 groups, in different ways, found it hard. They didn't feel comfortable. In many ways, they didn't feel that they belonged there.
Yeah.
So, and that took our level of understanding of why people don't go to museums to a new level, I think. And it's really up to the sector. And I think the sector has listened to that, and other people, other colleagues doing work in this area, and say, look, there is a problem, and the problem is not solved by outreach. It's not solved by just token, getting people to come in with a free bus pass or whatever. This is a really cultural way in which we work with communities, and this is not something you can solve overnight. It's something that's going to take a long time. But realizing there's an issue, realizing what the issue is, the first step. And I think some organisations have done that, and there's some fantastic organisations in the US that really have got a fantastic engagement with. I think there was a speaker at the Excite conference last year who was talking about the quality of engagement with local communities. You've got to devote management time to it. You've got to devote resources to it. You've got to find local champions, and you've got to find ways to really understand what it is that you can offer to communities and what they want and how you meet those needs. And it's not something that's going to be a short-term fix.
Yeah, and Emily was at our conference DASTEC last year, and I remember that she said we have to stop thinking about outreach, but we have to start thinking about inreach, which is a different way of looking at how you associate these communities with the work that you do. But that leads me to another question, which is, from the research that you have seen and the examples that you have seen, how much of this is taken on board by the centers to help them change their practices? Is there any kind of evidence that the research that you have been working on, or your colleagues, or the field of knowledge that has been developed over the years has really impacted the practices? Do we have practitioners now in museums that are better equipped, or how do you look at this?
I think if you look at the institutions which are at the forefront of education innovation in the sector, they've really grabbed it. They've really taken on board change. They really want to sort of tackle new things, and that's the ones I mentioned here: the Naturalises and the Exploratoriums and the Nemos. Those are the organisations which think have really grasped it. Some organisations. You work with a group of people, a Natural History Museum in London, we worked with a group of people, and they were really making great changes, and we're really taking things on board, and then staff moved on, and so we have to start again with a whole new group of people. So I think it's if you compare, say, the Excite conference or the ASTC conference now with 20 years ago, the topics of conversation, the people who come, the partnerships are quite different, and so there's a gradual layering of impact year by year, and that sort of. And if you looked at the work of Kevin Crowley and Karen Knutson, in Pittsburgh, their work has been long-term, systematic, impactful. So I don't think you'll be able to judge the impact for, say, another 10, 20 years. You look back and you think how things have changed. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's deeply frustrating when you give some people what you think is some insight and they ignore it. But then, hey, that's the way the world is sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and today maybe the competition is even harder actually than it was 10 years ago, but for informal science education. And just two examples. Very recently, Google made someone at Google and made a statement that maybe STEM education itself is not the big priority, but the priority is giving kids the soft skills they need to be prepared for the workforce. Something that was actually repeated by the boss of the owner of Alibaba, which is the Chinese Amazon company. He was at the World Economic Forum 2 weeks ago. His speech was all over Facebook for days and days, and he says the education has to change, but in the sense of actually bringing in the ways to prepare kids to use soft skills rather than learning STEM, and rather than knowledge, skills to use it. And so I was wondering if this questioning of the need to increase STEM education, have you seen that coming?
Yeah, one of our education ministers our new education minister was promoting soft skills. He's been talking about soft skills for a while. If you STEM is a slogan, it's a sort of a heuristic, a way of understanding a group of subjects which you never find working together in schools very well. What it means, it's code for let's get more people to study science to a high level so we can have engineers and scientists and whatever. So from a very narrow point of view, that sort of focus on the pipeline of producing scientists and engineers isn't a good thing for the majority of people in the world. Okay, so if we could focus our education in schools on everybody to make sure everyone is scientifically literate, environmentally literate, technologically, culturally literate, that's fine. So I'm quite happy with that. But if you look at what the soft skills are, which people, businesses and industries have said they wanted for the last 50 years, they are communication, problem solving, collaboration. I mean, that's what scientists do all the time. So, I mean, if you don't think scientists...
And that was my point, Justin. You come on the thing what I wanted to say is that it's not surprising that people who are actually in technology and in technological innovation come with that, because if you would look at it from the perspective of the scientific process, you would not ask that question, right?
Yeah, I think it's a very easy thing to say. We should shift. We should stop focusing on this, and we should focus on this. If you examine what that argument means, you're going to say so we should have people doing the sort of. If you had to choose a subject or subjects to promote soft skills, you'd probably choose science as much as you'd choose everything else. So, quite happy with soft skills, but if you think STEM isn't delivering soft skills, you're missing the point of what STEM actually does.
Exactly. So, there's already half an hour going, and I have a couple of more things to ask you. But before, you mentioned the number of people and the number of institutions doing good things. You mentioned Kevin Crowley and others. and Dawson. And so what if you want to tell someone where can you find the resources as a practitioner or researchers about informal science education? What would you say? Where to go?
Well, if they've got access to I mean, most of the people that we work with, the so-called practitioners with whom we work, and I would count myself as a practitioner because I do education research, and that just seems to be, putting theories into practice. But if we're talking about the majority of people who go to ASTC or Exeter or wherever, it's not a question of getting access to the journal. It's more a case of getting access to people who can process what the research is saying. So the places to go are the university departments of education, people who are doing learning sciences, people who know about science engagement, science communication. That's sort of a generic answer. Pragmatically, quick fix. Jill Hohenstein and Tiana Missouri have got a book, which I'm going to be talking at the launch of on Friday, called Focus on Learning, Museum Learning, Theory and Research as Tools for Enhancing Practice. That's one good place to sort of, that's an advert for that book coming out. That seems to be a good way forward. And the report which a number of colleagues and I were involved with a learning research agenda for natural history institutions has a lot of work, a lot of insight, I think, in designing research questions in the museum and science centre sector. And I think that's a good place to sort of begin to think, how can we focus on the research and the evaluation that we're doing in this sector in ways which are taking into account the sort of core things that these institutions offer, the scientific phenomena, the materials and so on, the ideas, and take into account the engagement, the learning, the wicked problems that in which these things are all set. That's a great volume, I think, a great document to get a sense of where the field is in terms of understanding how research can be used by institutions.
And if you don't mind, I may add to that every resources that you can find on informalscience.org from our own case Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, where you cannot enough promote to the field as being one of the places where most of these things can be found.
No, I think
so. Justin, I'd like to end, because that's where we started. The reason why I interviewed you was you now become the editor of this magazine about science education, and my point was, you're probably going to have an editorial line and a sort of an idea where you want to go with that. What's your big plan?
So it's Studies in Science Education is a journal which comes out twice a year, and it's distinctive in that it focuses on review papers. It focuses on papers which look at the big picture of education research rather than reporting on single studies. So it's a great place to go to get a sense of where the field is. So in the next edition, which comes out in March, there's a paper coming out on student learning through natural history museums. And our focus is on standing back and saying, what do we know about this field? So if the field wants to have a sort of an overview paper, this is a journal where it will be. And so we're looking at ways of we ignore these formal informal barriers and these structures, and we will look at learning wherever it takes place. And if it's school children learning in museums or people learning outdoors or whatever, we're interested in science education in the biggest possible arena, really.
Well, thank you so much. We have spent like a little bit more than half an hour together. It's much too short, I know, but we may find other ways to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and we see you soon some other place.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited to take part, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Bye then.
Bye-bye, everybody.